Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. If you didn't notice, yesterday Wimbledon got underway. The Wimbledon Championships, the tennis players, the crowds, the people eating strawberries, the games being cancelled because of rain, all the rest of it. And of course the ball boys and the ball girls, those young people who are there at the side of the court that basically when the balls goes dead on the ground, they run, they pick it up, they toss the ball ready to the tennis player ready to play for service and everything else. Now, it used to be at one time the ball boys, and it was only boys then, today's it's boys and girls, but the ball boys all came from Dr. Barnardo's schools. Dr. Barnardo's a children's charity. And from 1946 until 1966, all the Wimbledon ball boys came from the Dr. Barnardo's schools in and around Hertfordshire. Not necessarily orphans, but young people, maybe because they'd been raised in grinding poverty and sometimes even parents living in cramped conditions that they hadn't room to even house another child. They would end up in these Dr. Barnardo's schools. And Dr. Barnardo himself, now we still have Barnardos exist today. Barnardo still has a strong influence on how we treat children. And Barnardo's here in Ireland, for example, has had a big say on some of the legislation that has been passed to protect children in Irish society. But Dr. Barnardo was Irish. He was born in Dublin, in Dame Street, just beside Temple Bar in 1845. And if you're thinking Barnardo doesn't sound like an Irish name, you're quite right. His father came from a Jewish heritage, but he grew up in a Christian home. It was a Brethren home. And at age 16, he dropped out of school. He got a job as an apprentice to a wine merchant in Dublin. And he heard the gospel being preached. And Thomas Barnardo committed his life to Jesus Christ. And then he was working in what were called ragged schools. Ragged schools were these institutions that were set up to provide education for children that couldn't afford to go to school and wouldn't otherwise get an education. And so Thomas Barnardo was volunteering and helping in these ragged schools. And he went one day to hear a missionary to China speak, a great missionary called Hudson Taylor. And he was so inspired by Hudson Taylor's testimony of what God was doing in China that Thomas Barnardo vowed that he was going to be a missionary to China. And probably the main way that used to happen then, because it wasn't always easy to get to Africa, to China, to India, and one of the greatest ways of doing that was to train as a doctor and go out on a medical field and also preach the gospel. And so Dr. Barnardo registered in medical school in London, began training as a doctor, and when he was there, he got involved in the ragged schools again. And then something happened. In one of the ragged schools in which he was working, there was this young boy called Jim Jarvis. And at the end of the day, Jim didn't want to go home. And Barnardo got talking with him, discovered Jim didn't have a home. And he said, well, where do you sleep? And Jim said, I'll show you. And he took him up onto the roof of a building. And there were all these children sleeping. But on one roof, there was about 20 children sleeping on the roof up above the streets of London because they had nowhere else to stay. And Barnardo was so impacted by this, he had this vision from God that he was going to set up schools that would not just be providing education during the day, would also provide a home as well for children. And he talked about this with Lord Shaftesbury, great Christian member of Parliament at the time. And Lord Shaftesbury said to him, you have found your China. God can use you as a missionary right where you are in London. And so Barnardo began setting up these residential schools. Now, you know, there were lots of philanthropists at that time working there. And today we don't remember most of their names. So why do we remember Dr. Barnardo's? Well, basically, he was operating like most charities were. They did what they could, but they didn't want to overstretch themselves. So he'd set up these small residential schools, had children staying there, was doing a great job looking after them, but wasn't going to step out and commit himself and maybe fall into debt or whatever. And then this young boy called Jim Summers came asking if he needed a bed, he needed somewhere to stay. And the home was full. And Dr. Barnardo said, I'm sorry, we haven't got a place for you. And the young lad went away and died. He died of cold and exposure and hunger. And Dr. Barnardo was determined that he was never again going to turn a child away. And he began to step out in faith. And he began to open up homes even when he had no money to open them up, and open up schools. And God would just provide it again and again and again. And that's how the Barnardo's homes became so influential. And you know, he lived a lifetime of faith because he learned that he might have made a mistake with John Summers, but he learned from that mistake. He said, I'm never going to turn away a child ever again. There's times whenever we all make mistakes. There's times whenever we look back on we should have handled things differently and things did not turn out well as a result. And you can live your life consumed by guilt. You can live your life beating yourself up for that and always condemning yourself that you didn't do things perfectly. Or you can learn from your experience and say, I'm going to make sure that I never make that mistake ever again. That's what Thomas Barnardo did, and today the organization that he founded still has impact upon the way we look after children and care for children. I pray for you today, even if you've made mistakes, even if you've blown it, even if you've thought, wow, I can't come back from this. You know what? We can learn from our mistakes and God can use us again. Thomas Barnardo learned that. We can learn that too, in Jesus' name. God bless you today. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.